you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I just wanted to give a little bit of context to you all about why I wrote this book. So I actually started getting interested in school food when I was a graduate student in an environmental studies program. So I was really interested in farm to school, and I thought that that was something that I wanted to learn a lot more about. But as I was actually starting to spend time in school kitchens and cafeterias and reading a lot of the existing things that people had written about school food, it really seemed to me at the time, so this is kind of like, I guess, in 2008 to 2010, that nobody was really talking about the role of workers and what you need to be doing in order to really make it possible for more local food to be served in schools. So I kept hearing people within the farm to school world sort of talk about the challenges that they were facing, not only from a budgetary standpoint in terms of local food maybe costing more, but also just from the standpoint of like, really not being able to serve a ton of food because they weren't doing a lot of cooking in schools. So that got me really curious about, why do we do so little from scratch cooking in American public schools when that's relatively common in other countries that have national school lunch programs. And I think as I started to spend more time in kitchens and cafeterias around Connecticut, where I was at the time, a lot of workers would start bringing in old photographs and show me that, hey, we used to have a bakery here. We used to actually be doing a lot more scratch cooking. So some of them who had been in their jobs for maybe 3 or 4 decades had a little bit more of a strong memory of doing some of that work on site. And they would also talk to me about how not only was that something that they took a lot of pride in, but they also tended to have longer hours when they were doing that work of scratch cooking. So that's something that got me really interested in just trying to understand a little bit more about the labor structure of what school food looks like today and how it relates to not only, I think, the need to create better quality jobs in K-12 cafeterias, but also how it relates to this broader goal of really trying to create a better food system in the US. So I have some slides with lots of images that I prepared for today. So I'm going to actually start sharing my slides with you all today. So let's see. All right, so I should start off by just saying Happy Food Service Workers Recognition Day to all of you. I'm not sure how it feels specifically there in Massachusetts, but I do feel like at least at the national level, the pandemic, I know it's created a lot of challenges in terms of what food service actually looks like on the ground, but I do think it has had this effect of at least focusing more public attention on the role of cafeteria workers and of school food more broadly in making sure that community food needs are actually met. So there have been studies and reports like throughout the pandemic showing that in a lot of communities, it's actually K-12 schools that are feeding more people even than like the emergency food system in terms of like food banks and food pantries. So I think, we have to not only be thinking about our school food programs as something that's really important for kids in terms of their education and health, but also as something that's really important for just making sure that people have enough to eat. There is, I think, also a struggle though, in that within the school food world, there tends to be a lot more attention being given to just the needs of kids. And workers can sometimes be an afterthought in terms of what their needs look like. So kind of early on in the pandemic, I actually wrote this op-ed with a friend of mine that was in the USA Today, kind of urging people to think about really like what cafeteria workers were facing around the country, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic when it wasn't really clear exactly how COVID was transmitted or how risky it would be to be working in different kinds of kitchen environments. And one of the things that we really tried to advocate for was improving labor conditions in the long term, but also making sure that workers were receiving things like hazard pay and paid sick days so that they could, be, not as vulnerable during the pandemic. So I wanted to give just a little bit of context about who K-12 cafeteria workers are broadly in terms of like the country as a whole. So one thing that I wanted to mention, because Rand and I were talking about, just this question of why when you look at schools, school kitchen and cafeteria workers tend to be some of the lowest paid employees. And I wanted to sort of point out that not only are K-12 cafeteria workers food chain workers, so farm workers, slaughterhouse workers, food service workers tend to be some of the lowest paid occupations in general. So it's not a total surprise that K-12 cafeteria workers would also fit into that lower wage category. But I think that K-12 cafeteria workers, because they also are working with kids and providing not only for kids' nutritional needs, but also for their emotional needs, can be thought of as care workers. And we also see that within the care sector, that's another place in the US economy in particular, where we tend to pay very, very low wages. So I think that K-12 cafeteria workers are sort of at this intersection of food chain and care work, both of which are actually pretty low wage sectors, but that I think have actually received a lot more attention during the pandemic as being things that are actually like crucial for the whole rest of our economy to function. And I think that that creates in some ways an organizing opportunity in that we can really sort of shift the conversation in terms of what sort of things we need to value as a society as producing economic and social value. So the last time that there was any kind of national study of the K-12 cafeteria workforce in the US was published in 2010, and that was drawing from 2008 data. And that study showed that there were about 420,000 K-12 cafeteria workers in the US. And at that point in time, about 93% of them were women. So I think that that number has gone down a little bit, but we're still talking about a very, very feminized workforce. And the School Nutrition Association did release this compensation and benefits report in 2012. This was the first time they'd done one of these reports in probably 15 years or more. And their study is not nationally representative, but they did have a little over 1,000 school districts from across the country participate in it. And it cost about $200 to get access to this report. But if any of you want me to send it to you, I'm more than happy to do that. Because it's interesting because it looks at wage and benefit packages kind of from a regional standpoint. It looks at the difference between unionized and non-unionized districts, and it looks at a variety of different sort of job categories. And for frontline workers, what they found was that in 2019, the average wage was between $11 and $13 per hour for workers who would be like kind of head cook and below type positions. And in general, what the study also found was that workers were employed for an average of about 25 hours per week for 40 weeks out of the year. I think that, that obviously looks probably different right now during COVID, but pre-COVID, that's kind of what the numbers looked like. So one of the things to kind of take away from that is that not only is there this kind of overproduction of part-time jobs in the K-12 cafeteria sector, but also these jobs tend to pay more than minimum wage. They certainly don't pay a family sustaining wage in most places. But the problem isn't just low wages, it's also short hours. So one of the reasons why I tend to talk a lot about scratch cooking is in part because it really creates opportunities for more full-time work so that you can get away from those really short hour positions. And it tends to create more opportunities for job mobility. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on using a case study from Minneapolis. So another thing that the study found is that there's a huge discrepancy from district to district in terms of what it actually means for a worker to be considered full-time for the purposes of benefits. So some districts it's as low as 10 hours and others it's as much as 40 hours, but the average nationwide was 30 hours per week for workers to be qualifying for the benefits that would be made available to all full-time workers. In general, there was also an effect where you have to work longer hours to qualify as a full-time worker in smaller districts. My guess would be that some of that also has to do with the fact that unionized districts tend to correlate more with larger sized districts as well. And then the other thing that this study found was that union membership across the board for non-managerial workers was at about 30%, maybe a little less. But again, this isn't a nationally representative study. It's a study of about 1,200 or so districts. But I think that it's important to just recognize that those numbers are so much lower than what it would be if you were looking, for instance, at teachers' unions. So just recognizing that the union density for cafeteria workers is just tremendously lower, I think probably by about 3 times that of what we see for teachers. Or maybe 2 times. 2 times is probably more accurate. I have a little video here that I'm actually going to skip over, but for those who are interested in watching it later, it's just workers sort of talking about why for them getting access to full-time jobs is so important. But I think what I'll kind of move us over to a little bit more quickly is just this question of why do these jobs look the way that they do? And I think in order to understand that, we really have to look more deeply at the history of the national school lunch and breakfast programs in the United States. So I'm just going to talk about school lunch, in part because this program is a little older than school breakfast and it's larger, but more or less the two programs kind of function in the same way. So one thing that's important to sort of recognize is that there's always been like a dual priority of the National School Lunch Act to not only focus on children's health and well-being, but also to be focusing on agricultural commodities and supporting particular kinds of producers. So those have been kind of the two priorities throughout the history of school lunch in the US. And right now, about $14.2 billion of funding goes into the school lunch program alone from the federal government. The federal government actually spends over $18 billion a year on both the lunch and breakfast program combined. About 30 million children participate, and this is out of approximately 50 million who would have access to the National School Lunch Program in their schools. And part of the reason why we see so many kids opting out of this program is because we have this three-tiered model where kids qualify for free, reduced price, or paid meals based on their family income. So in the US, in a lot of ways, school food is really sort of thought of as more of a child welfare program, and the majority of students, about 2/3 who participate in the program, are coming from lower income families. So I think that that's a real problem, because when we have so many middle class and upper middle class families opting out of the program, it sort of sends this political signal that this isn't a program that we need to prioritize investing in. So in general, one of the things that I found in looking at the US National School Lunch Program relative to others is that in places where they have universal meal programs, they tend to be much higher quality, and they tend to honestly provide better quality jobs for the people who are employed in them as well. And part of that is because there tends to be more of a focus on quality in those programs because all children are impacted. So there's kind of a deeper level of public investment. So right now, the reimbursement rate for a lunch that would be served at the free category is about $3.60. But even the US Department of Agriculture's own data shows that on average, it actually costs schools more like $3.81 to actually produce a meal. So if you wonder, like, why schools are constantly like facing like tough financial situations in the world of school food, it's really because they're being asked to prepare meals at below what is like the true cost of producing those meals. So for those of you who have been in this world for a while, you probably know that this is a deeply sort of contested political space, and a lot of the fights around school food tend to be about specifically what the meal pattern tends to look like. And I think that a lot of the focus really is on nutrition when people talk about school food, and workers to a very large extent have been really left out of the public conversation in terms of things that we really should be caring about when it comes to school food. So a big reason why I wrote the book that I did is to try to convince people who think that they only care about the quality of the food, that they in fact really have to care about the workers, because if you don't invest in the workers and you don't start to empower people to actually be having more control over their own local school food systems, it's going to be really, really challenging to ever like reach a point where we truly have healthy and fair and sustainable food in our school food programs. So I just kind of wanted to give a little bit of historical context into this question of, why do we maybe not see a lot of scratch cooking today? So really, for the first 2 decades of the National School Lunch Program, the majority of students who participated did not look like this. They were basically white kids from middle-class families. And a lot of the poor children, particularly from communities of color in urban areas, were systematically excluded from the program. And so there was this real sort of public reckoning in the late 1960s and early 1970s where people started to realize that, like, hey, there's a lot of structural racism embedded in this program. There's a ton of kids who should have access to free meals and instead don't. So at this point in time, a number of different kind of activist organizations and different anti-hunger groups really pressured the federal government to expand access to free meals. And on the one hand, they were really, really successful. So we can see kind of starting in the late 1960s, there's a pretty rapid increase in the percentage of meals that were served in the US that were this free or reduced price category. So on the one hand, this movement was really, really great at expanding poor children's access to school meals. On the other hand, it didn't really look like continuing to invest in this style of cooking from scratch. What ended up happening was most schools, as they introduced free meals for the first time, relied on frozen meal pack or airline type lunches. So these are meals that essentially would have been produced either by a faraway factory and shipped to the schools frozen, or maybe in districts that were very large, the government would have provided equipment grants for schools to actually be doing their own pre-plate system. But the sort of effect on workers and labor is roughly the same with both of those. Instead of having a lot of on-site workers doing from scratch production in the schools themselves, what you end up having is a lot of centralized production of prepared meals and then a lot of very short hour positions in the schools themselves to just reheat and distribute the meals. So it was really during that time that a lot of the people that I interviewed sort of commented on this trend taking root where it sort of became that central kitchens and heat and serve became much, much more common in schools. And a lot of the things that people maybe enjoyed about feeling creative when it came to cooking were things that they no longer really got to feel when it came to cooking. And for a lot of the people who were involved in programs at that time, they sort of commented on how it became much, much more difficult for people to really survive in those positions. So turnover started to increase a lot more, and they started to feel like it was just a lot harder to really recruit people into school food service to begin with. And I think a lot of that really has to do with just the change in what the job actually started to look like. So in today's central kitchens, you know, we find a lot of this type of equipment, a lot of pre-packaging. I think that that type of thing is actually even more true right now during COVID. I think some districts that were doing a lot of scratch cooking, if they're having to do a lot of grab and go service, are sort of reverting even more to pre-packed stuff. And what I think we can sort of think about with this model is that when you're relying on a lot of pre-packed foods, a lot of the skill that goes into transforming raw ingredients into finished meals is embedded in the products at the manufacturing facility instead of embodied in the workers themselves. So then it starts to become like, you know, much easier for people to say, oh, well, these workers don't deserve wages that are high because all they're doing is reheating food. Because, you know, traditionally people, you know, when they look at school food service, I think a lot of children and parents might see, you know, the broader work that goes into really caring for kids, getting to know them, understanding their individual needs and personalities. But for the most part, policymakers don't really think about that emotional labor. They just think about, you know, you're getting nutrients into kids and all you're doing is reheating. So it's not that difficult. So I think that this, this issue of a lot of the culinary skill being embedded in the products is a big part of why there's this rationale that workers don't actually need to be paid very much, coupled with the fact that we never really tend to value or, you know, pay for care work. So all the work that goes into caring for kids, a lot of it is done in an unpaid capacity, or it's expected to be very, very low paid. So I think that one of the real strategies in terms of actually getting workers to have wages and hours that really can sustain them and their families and allow them to retire in dignity has to be rooted in actually cooking from scratch. So one of the ways that I think we can sort of build community support for this idea is by pointing to all the different kinds of additives that are found in food and are typically embedded in those products at the point of manufacturing. So if you talk to like some of the school districts that are really like leading this movement for scratch cooked food, they'll show you lists like this. So this is an example of a list from Minneapolis Public Schools. So these are what they call their ingredients of concern that they want to make sure that they don't have in any of their school meals. So not only will they screen the products that they're purchasing to make sure that these items aren't in those products, but they'll also say, you know, one of the reasons why we're doing a lot of scratch cooking is so that we have control and we're making sure that we don't have these kinds of artificial chemicals that might be you know, bad for our students' health in the products themselves. And there are some companies that are definitely trying to kind of capitalize on this trend and say, hey, we can give you these same clean label kind of products. And don't worry, you don't actually have to invest in your workers. You can actually just substitute higher quality industrial foods, you know, for what you were serving before. So you can kind of think of it as like heat and serve 2.0. And in my book, I talk about this as real food light. So it kind of looks really good on the website, right? This is their sort of, you know, product advertisement. And then when you see it in schools, it tends to look, you know, a little bit more just like regular heat and serve style fare. And on the one hand, yes, this is probably good in that it is reducing the amount of chemicals that students are consuming. But on the other hand, this is keeping intact the exact same labor structure of short hours, and it's not really doing anything to help school food programs support local farmers or regional food economies, because a lot of these models, like Revolution Foods and others, really rely on having a more regionalized like way of sourcing food and distributing it. So that real connection to a more local kind of food and farm economy isn't as possible with this type of model because they depend so much on scale. So I wanted to show as an alternative to that, the example of Minneapolis Public Schools. And as I'm pulling up the different thing I'm going to share, I'll just say that Minneapolis Public Schools has been actively transitioning away from a central kitchen model. So they actually were preparing little pre-packed meals, more or less, in their central kitchen from the 1970s until like 2010. Same central kitchen, same model of production. And really, in about 2010, they started investing in building on-site kitchens and transitioning their schools away from the pre-packed model to doing on-site production. So this video that I'm about to show you features a number of interviews from workers in Minneapolis Public Schools reflecting on what that change has meant for their job quality. And a few of the big things are that, one, it really has created a lot more full-time jobs. So instead of having a lot of jobs in this 3 to 4 hour range, there's a lot more jobs in the 6 to 8 hour range. And this shift also created a whole new sort of class position called a prep cook that didn't exist before. And the district offered a lot of training to help existing employees who maybe didn't feel confident in their own culinary skills be eligible for that new position of job. So you'll hear from some of the people who went through that in this little video.
I'm cutting, I'm chopping. So like today we had baked chicken. I did all the chicken the day before, seasoned it up, got it to marinate.
We make a wild rice meatloaf. The fresh hamburger comes in, fresh turkey. We'll cook the wild rice. We mix it in a big mixer or by hand. It's really amazing. I mean, it used to be everything came in a package and you just threw it in the oven, pulled it out when it was hot. But now we're actually given a recipe, given the ingredients, and making something that these kids enjoy.
Well, when I first started, it was semi-homemade. And so then the next transition was, we should just do it all from the central kitchen, and we're going to do a lot of pre-pack. We can do it best. We can portion control, and we can save money, and we can do it all centrally at the kitchen, and we can save on labor. And we'll just send you the food, and then you just heat it up. Everything was all like packaged, like a lot of plastic. The vegetables and the fruit came in packages, and it visually did not look appealing at all.
I spent some time going from school to school to school and just saying, okay, what are some of the things we can do immediately? Well, maybe we can do salad bars. That was a big impact. Then I looked at the schools that had remnants of kitchen and said, okay, let's start there. The high school still has some kitchens. Although antiquated, they were still kitchens. The district embraced the changes and allocated budget to build kitchens.
We are now all about farm to school. We're all about healthy, we're giving them fruits and vegetables, and we're making real, true food.
I like it. It's good. It's good quality. I wouldn't serve it if it wasn't. I would never serve the kids anything that I wouldn't eat myself.
I just miss the school food when school's out because during the summer I don't eat as good as I do here with all the grains and the bean salads and the lettuce and the fresh fruit. I was tired of waitressing. I'm getting older, so I was looking for, as my mother said, a real job. I've never had a job like this before. I'm in heaven. The day flies by and I get to know the kids personally, and I enjoy teaching them how to eat.
I noticed that the new people that are coming on have gone to culinary school, have been chefs at other restaurants or hotels, and they're coming on board and joining us lunch ladies. Yeah. And teaching us some of their trades too.
I had graduated from the Cordon Bleu like a year or two before that, and I was kind of bopping around at different restaurants. When I first started, it just kind of reminded me of how it was just to work in a regular kitchen, just a little bit bigger.
So my background being in hospitality, I look at this as we are a restaurant. To say that we don't need people with culinary skill or there's not as much excitement in this as there is in a restaurant, I think is a fallacy.
At the catering company, I started at like 8 in the morning, and then I would work till about 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. And when I came here, we started at 5:30, so it was harder to get up. But I'm done at 2, which is awesome because I have 2 kids and it just gives me more time with them. A lot of food service jobs is nights and weekends and holidays. Coming here was amazing. Like, it gave me the freedom to raise the family that I wanted to have.
And we're trying more and more to hire internally and train them for those positions. We developed career path. We started developing training module. We offered prep cook training. We offered culinary training. So yeah, we have had quite a few actually that have taken that direction.
I'm learning a lot of new things and I really enjoy it, and I don't see myself going anywhere else after this.
Okay, so I'll just mention that one of the things that you may have, oops, sorry, one second. Okay, sorry, you may have picked up on a little bit also in that video is that there was a little bit of attention when Minneapolis first started moving in this direction of scratch cooking in terms of just what they were doing with hiring. So in a lot of ways, their strategy was essentially to fill vacant positions with people who were coming in with more culinary skill. But then they wanted to make sure that they were also creating opportunities for people who had been with the district for a number of years beforehand, who maybe hadn't had the opportunity to learn on the job since they were mainly just doing heat and serve, to also have those opportunities to move into those positions. So over time, I think that they were able to create some good training mechanisms. And I would say that their food service director is kind of one of the first to admit that in maybe the first year or 2 of their transition process, he feels like he didn't listen as much to the workers who were there as he should have. And so that's like a lesson that he feels like he learned, and now sort of talks to other people in the school food world about how important it is to really be communicating with and listening to like the existing workers, because a lot of them really have a lot to contribute and can end up feeling alienated if they feel like they aren't being involved in the transition process. So I think that that piece of communication is something that they became much better with over time. And as I was comparing Minneapolis with other districts that were kind of following a similar transition process. One of the things that I found was that it tended to be the districts that really were involving the workers most in decision making and really communicating with them about why they were doing things that tended to have the best outcomes in terms of really not only improving food quality, but also improving kind of the overall like operations of their program. So I think that that piece of really communicating the why with workers instead of just like, you know, sometimes like it can feel like decisions are just kind of coming from up here, but you don't really understand like why those things are happening, seemed to go a long way in terms of really helping people feel like they were involved in the process and part of like a mission to really improve what school food is. So that's one thing that was, for me, really noticeable when I was interviewing people in Minneapolis, was that it really seemed like the workers there were taking a lot of pride in like being part of this movement to provide real food in schools. And that was something that I think as like there started to be more sort of press attention to what was going on in Minneapolis, more and more people who hadn't considered school food service as a potential career path started to apply for those jobs. So one of the things that that meant was more men actually started applying for jobs. So I think that that's something that like is a little bit of a tension, and that like you don't necessarily like want, you know, for job quality to improve and then to have all those jobs taken, you know, by men, when this has actually been, I think, a field that women have been working for like in a, you know, just really in some ways underappreciated capacity for a long time. So I think that that is one tension that districts that are like following this model still are facing, is that on the one hand, they think it's really good that it's becoming a field that isn't so highly gendered, but they want to make sure that they're not ultimately creating like a gender hierarchy in terms of who has like access to the higher paid versus lower paid jobs. I'm going to go back to just a couple more slides, and then I think we're going to do a couple questions, if that's okay. So I think I'm sharing the wrong thing. Sorry, one second. Okay. So I just have a couple summary points in terms of things that I think are really important for us to focus on. So even just from the subtitle of my book, prioritizing real food and real jobs, I think we can't have one without the other. And just, I know that those are terms that might not be immediately apparent. So I wanted to flag that as I was working on this project, I was actually involved with Unite Here and their Real Food, Real Jobs campaign, which really isn't going on so much anymore. But I just wanted to sort of note that the way that they conceptualize real jobs is jobs that pay a living wage with health or retirement benefits, that allow workers to disclose food safety or quality issues, and to form a union through a legal and democratic process. So how can we actually build community and political support for real food and real jobs? Well, I think investing in school-based community organizing is a really important way to do that. So you all, I think, are already you know, a leg up on that because you're with unionized school districts. So I think that being able to have these school-based campaigns is a really powerful mechanism. I first got involved in this space with the Real Food, Real Jobs campaign after the first of these campaigns was run in Chicago public schools. The workers in New Haven wanted to follow a similar model. So the first thing that we did was we actually had workers survey each other. So this was a really powerful exercise, and that it was really part of like organizing in and of itself by having workers talk with their coworkers to collect these survey questionnaires. It was a way for people who maybe you know, didn't always get a chance to talk with employees outside of their own school kitchen to sort of recognize that, hey, across the district, we're actually seeing similar problems. So we collected, at the time there were about 200 workers, and we collected a little over 100 surveys. So even that data collection thing, because it was something that involved like the frontline workers as researchers, was something that I think was really important and powerful in terms of really building the capacity to launch a sustained campaign. So that worker survey in New Haven took place in 2012. And then during the kind of 6 to 8 months following that, a lot of the workers were involved in delegations to like the mayor's office to hand him a copy of the report. They did a lot of door knocking, and they did a lot of community engagement, both in English and Spanish language, going on local radio stations. And in the end, in their 2013 contract negotiation, they had a number of really important wins. So they got the district to create 32 new full-time cook positions. And then another thing that was really important for them was that substitute workers were not being treated as like permanent workers for the purposes of them actually like sort of like becoming like eligible for moving up like in the hierarchy. So they were able to change how the district conceptualized like the sort of classification of subs. And then the last kind of major thing was they were able to secure a commitment from the district to pilot more fresh cooking in the schools. So I think that those were all important wins for them that really related to, how do we focus on improving the food quality and the job quality simultaneously. And there have been a number of other kind of successful community campaigns that I think we can learn from. So for instance, in New York City public schools, there was a community campaign that had a lot of support from labor to actually get universal free school meals in all of New York City public schools. I think that that's a really great one to look at. And I think that right now, in particular, there's a lot of sort of renewed national level advocacy and attention around this idea of having universal free school meals. So I think right now is a really great time both to be working at the local level and the national level to be pushing for universal free. I also think that it's really important to be creating space for young people to be involved in shaping what their school food programs look like. I think that that's a really important way to build community support. So having youth advisory councils, I think is something I've seen a number of districts do that tends to work really well. In particular, if the youth are actually empowered to help make decisions, I think it tends to work less well if it's basically like a glorified sort of like taste testing scenario. Similarly, with inviting parents and community members to participate, I've seen some really cool examples of places that will have like community sourced recipes that they try to like source from different members of the district and then scale up like for school food service. And I think that that's something that can work really well, but it depends on having like authentic like engagement and involvement over time. I think another thing that I've seen in some districts that I think is really cool is this idea of building school community kitchens. So helping people understand that school kitchens are a part of our public infrastructure, and school kitchens oftentimes aren't really used in the afternoons, weekends, and they're less used during the summer. So if we can start to think about how we use our school kitchens as community resources or community assets, that can be a way to really build more public support for actually investing money in this kind of infrastructure. And then I think there are a lot of really great ways to start envisioning our public food programs as hubs for purchasing good food so that we can actually improve the quality of jobs across the food chain. I think in Massachusetts, Boston is an example of a school district that has adopted the good food purchasing policy. And I guess I would also just add that right now there are a ton of organizations that are working in this space of school food reform. And from my perspective, it's really been in the last maybe like 3 to 4 years that a greater percentage of them have started to pay attention to this question of labor. So I am hoping that as we sort of move forward, this question of how we actually invest in workers and how, if we're doing lobbying, we're actually making sure that we're asking the federal government to make special provisions for actually like, giving school districts more money to pay workers. I'm hoping that that will be kind of a bigger part of the conversation. So one example of that is that in 2019, Ilhan Omar and Bernie Sanders, they released a bill called the Universal School Meals Act. And one of the elements of that is increasing the reimbursement rate to $3.81 per meal. So that's like an example of like, a bill that's actually saying we need to make sure that we are providing more money for a per meal reimbursement so that we can actually provide better quality jobs for the workers themselves. I also just wanted to sort of end by mentioning that there's a lot of work that can also be done at the state level. So the Food Research Action Coalition has a really great resource that they update annually that shows school meals legislation and funding by state. I don't personally know exactly what Massachusetts looks like, but there tends to be a lot of differences across states in terms of whether states contribute anything, and if they do contribute, what that looks like. And then there's just a couple examples that I wanted to point to at the end in terms of really interesting progressive campaigns that have gone on at the state level. So right now, Vermont is really trying to become the first state to provide universal school meals to all students across the state. And just last week, the California governor approved an additional $80 million in state funding for school meals to sort of help account for the fact that it's really challenging during the pandemic. So as was mentioned earlier, a lot of school districts are seeing like major declines in participation. So this is an example of what state level advocacy was able to do in order to say, hey, we actually really need to make sure that we are making it to where these programs can be like fiscally solvent. And then I just wanted to end by saying, this is the book that I wrote, and if any of you want to chat about any topics related to the book or anything I talked about today, I'm really, really happy to continue doing that. And here is my contact information, so you can reach me through any of those channels. And I apologize because I know I probably talked a little more than I was supposed to, but I think we at least probably have time for maybe like 5 minutes of questions, and I can sneak over to teach my class.
Well, first of all, Jennifer, what an outstanding presentation. So coherent.
Sorry,
I'm glad you went on for so long. I learned so much, and it gives us so much to do at Local 888, and so many things that we can think about that we could initiate here in Massachusetts.